All right, so today we're going deep on deprogramming violence. We're going to be looking at this article called, you guessed it, Deprogramming Violence. It's it's pretty intense. It takes a look at how violence, it's not just about like the physical stuff, right? Like punches and kicks. It's like this whole energy that we learn, and then we just like pass it down over generations. Kind of a messed up inheritance, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it really gets into how that violence becomes like embedded in our lives. It's not, just about those individual acts, but it's like this repeating cycle, this pattern, and we often don't even realize it's happening.
Exactly. And the article, it like jumps right in, it talks about the cycle of violence. And then it brings up this idea of a violent womb, like even before we're born. The
Wow.
environment we're in, the emotions that our mothers experience, it can all shape us, it really makes you think.
It's a really powerful point. It's like challenging us to really consider how deep these patterns can go. And I mean, the author using this imagery of a violent womb, it really shows us just how early that cycle can actually begin.
It does. It does. It makes you wonder, like, what kind of energy were we even surrounded by, right, before we were
Yeah.
born? And then how has that, like, ended up shaping our own responses to the world, to stress, to conflict?
Yeah, it's a big question.
It is. It is.
It's something worth thinking about for sure. I mean, even if we, think about our own childhoods, even if you weren't exposed to physical violence or anything, were there other like subtle forms of negativity, anger, maybe distrust that sort of like permeated your environment?
Mm.
Did you see the adults around you handling conflict in a healthy way? These early experiences, I mean, they can really have a lasting impact.
Oh, for sure. Okay, so we've got this, cycle of violence starting even before birth, like we were talking about. But the article doesn't stop there, right?
Right.
It goes on to break violence down into like all these different forms. Some of them you might not even, think of as violence.
Yeah, and that's what's really interesting here. I think it goes beyond that, like obvious physical violence, and it exposes those insidious forms, that often we don't even notice. We
Right.
might not even recognize them as violence because they're so ingrained in our culture and in our society.
Yeah, yeah, totally. So like give me an example.
Okay, well, let's take verbal violence. This is something we've probably all, experienced at some point, or even inflicted on others without even realizing it.
Uh-huh.
Those harsh words, cutting remarks, even jokes, right? Jokes at someone else's expense. They all contribute to this like subtle but really pervasive energy of violence.
You know what? Now that you mention it, I'm remembering like my dad, he used to always make these sarcastic comments, but disguised as humor,
Yeah,
It never really felt good, but it was just like accepted as his way. But looking back now, I can see how like that kind of verbal violence, it could really chip away at your self-esteem, over time.
exactly. And the article, I think, helps us to recognize these patterns so we can start to challenge them, you know.
Right, right.
It's not about blame or guilt or anything. It's about awareness.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Okay, so verbal violence, that's one, one mask, let's say. What other forms does the author highlight?
Well, there's emotional violence, and this is when someone uses their emotions to like control you or manipulate you. Things like guilt trips, withholding affection, or constantly playing the victim.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's psychological violence, which is all about like undermining your sense of self-worth.
Oh, yeah, I have definitely been there. The gaslighting, the put downs, it's so subtle, but it makes you question your own sanity.
Yeah, it's insidious.
It really is.
And the article names several other types of violence too that you might not immediately think of, like spiritual violence, where religion or spirituality is used for control or manipulation, and economic violence, which is all about using money or resources to have power over someone. It's a pretty comprehensive look at how violence shows up in our lives in ways we might not expect.
It really is. It really is. So, what's the point of breaking it all down like this? What does it actually do for us?
I think it's all about raising our awareness, ultimately. The more we understand the different faces of violence, the better equipped we are to recognize it in our own lives and then to make different choices.
That makes sense. But all this talk about violence, it can feel kind of overwhelming. Like, where do we even begin to address it when it seems so ingrained in everything?
Right. Well, that's where the author's personal journey comes in. They talk about growing up in a violent household, seeking refuge in gang life, and then eventually realizing that they were actually perpetuating the same cycle they were trying to escape.
Whoa. So how did they break free? What was their turning point?
It was a process, a process of self-discovery. They realized that they were um, attracting abusive partners and then also to repressing their own anger. So basically, they were living out the violence that they had internalized.
So they were like mirroring those patterns they'd learned.
Exactly, and that's a huge point, right? We often recreate the dynamics we're familiar with, even if they're harmful.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. So how did they like break free from that cycle then? What did deprogramming look like for them?
Well, it started with self-awareness, having to, acknowledge their own role in keeping that violence going, you know, both towards themselves and towards others. And that's where this whole concept of self-abuse comes in.
Self-abuse, what does that even mean?
I think it's about recognizing the ways that we harm ourselves, whether it's through like negative self-talk or neglecting our needs, or even, staying in relationships that aren't good for us. The author realized um, they were constantly putting themselves down, not valuing their own worth.
Right, right. It's like if you grow up around violence, you kind of start to believe that's what you deserve. You might not even like know what a healthy relationship is supposed to look like.
Exactly. And so deprogramming then becomes about like unlearning those patterns, those harmful patterns, and replacing them with self-love, compassion. It's about treating ourselves with the same kindness and respect that we would offer to like someone we loved.
Okay, I get that. But practically speaking, where do we even begin with all this? The idea of deprogramming sounds pretty intense.
It doesn't have to be, though. It's more about those small steps, consistent steps towards like healing and growth. Like think of it this way. If you're used to, talking to yourself harshly, try to catch yourself in those moments and then consciously choosing a kinder, more supportive voice.
So like instead of saying, I'm so stupid for making that mistake, I might say, okay, everyone makes mistakes. What can I learn from this?
Exactly. It's that shift from self-criticism to self-compassion. And it's not just about like our thoughts either. It's about our actions too, right?
Oh, right.
Are we taking care of ourselves physically, emotionally? Are we setting healthy boundaries in our relationships?
It's interesting thinking back to all those different forms of violence that the article talked about. It's like we can do all of those to ourselves too.
Yeah.
Like we can be verbally abusive to ourselves or emotionally manipulative with ourselves, even spiritually violent, like if we're using some kind of belief system to punish ourselves.
That's a really good point. It highlights how interconnected it all is, right? The way we treat ourselves is often a reflection of how we treat other people.
So deprogramming is really about breaking free from this whole cycle of violence, but like at its core, within ourselves.
Yeah, precisely. And it's an ongoing process. It's not like there's a magic switch or anything. It's about being mindful, making conscious choices, and being compassionate with ourselves along the way.
All that makes me think about that quote, be the change you want to see in the world. Maybe it really does start with like addressing that violence that we carry within us.
That's a beautiful connection. And the author actually takes that idea even further. They say that personal transformation, it's not just about individual growth, it creates a ripple effect.
A ripple effect. What do you mean?
Well, imagine if each of us committed to, deprogramming that violence within ourselves. What kind of impact would that have on, like, our relationships, our communities, even the world as a whole? The author believes that as we heal ourselves, we actually contribute to healing the collective.
So you're saying that addressing our own internal violence, we could actually contribute to like a more peaceful world.
It's a bold idea, isn't it? But think about it. If we can reduce the violence that we inflict on ourselves, wouldn't we naturally be less likely to inflict it on others? Wouldn't we be, you know, more empathetic, more compassionate?
I see where you're going with this. It's like if we can't even be kind to ourselves, how can we expect to be kind to other people? And how can we expect to create a peaceful world if we're constantly like at war within ourselves?
Exactly. The author suggests that our internal state has a really profound impact on our external reality. And they actually point to a specific form of self-abuse that a lot of us overlook, something we do every single day.
Okay, I'm curious now. What is it? Come on, don't leave me hanging. What's this everyday self-abuse thing?
Well, the author says it's how we talk to ourselves, that inner critic, always full of doubt and judgment. It's like a form of violence, but we think it's normal.
Huh. Never thought of it that way, but yeah, I get it. We're always telling ourselves we're not good enough, not smart enough, not whatever enough. We just beat ourselves up over every little mistake.
And the author's point is that this kind of self-talk, it's not just harmless chatter, it's self-sabotage. It keeps us stuck in these cycles of violence.
So instead of all that criticism, we should be like practicing self-compassion, treating ourselves with kindness like we would a friend.
Exactly. Remember that deprogramming idea? It's all about recognizing those violent patterns and then choosing a different path. It starts with finding peace within ourselves.
Okay, I'm on board with that. But how do we actually do it? How do we quiet that inner critic that's been there forever?
It's a process, for sure. It's about noticing those negative thoughts and then consciously swapping them for more supportive ones. Like, instead of, I'm such a failure, maybe you try, okay, I messed up, but I can learn from this.
So it's like we're retraining our brains to be more encouraging instead of always criticizing.
Exactly. And it's not just the words, it's the tone, the energy. Remember how the author talked about vibrations? Constantly hitting ourselves with negativity creates a totally different vibe than if we're cultivating self-love.
Right. If we're vibrating on a like self-judgment frequency, it's going to be hard to attract good things, right? But if we can raise it to self-compassion, then maybe we can really change how we experience the world.
And that leads us back to the author's big vision. A world where violence isn't the norm. They really believe this transformation starts within each of us, with every choice we make, every thought we have.
So wrapping up our deep dive on deprogramming violence, it sounds like the takeaway is this. Personal transformation isn't just about feeling good. It's about creating peace and compassion that can spread outwards to our relationships, our communities, the whole world.
That's a great way to put it. And it all begins with that powerful act of self-love, recognizing our own worth, treating ourselves with kindness. From there, anything is possible.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned something about violence and the power of deprogramming. Remember, the journey begins within. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep choosing love. 2, 8, C, or M.